The Armenian Massacres in Ottoman Turkey. A disputed genocide. Critique. By Guenter Lewy. 2005. No authentic documentary evidence exists to prove the culpability of the central government of Turkey for the massacres of 1915–16. It is also significant that not one of the many thousands of officials who would have been involved in so far-reaching a scheme as a premeditated plan to destroy the Armenians has ever come forth to reveal the plot. The order for the final solution of the Jewish question also is not embodied in a written record, but the major elements of the decision-making process leading up to the annihilation of the Jews can be reconstructed from events, court testimony that has been subject to cross-examination, and a rich store of authentic documents. Barring the unlikely discovery of some new sensational documents in the Turkish archives, it is safe to say that no such evidence exists for the events of 1915–16. In the absence of this kind of proof, the Armenian side has relied upon materials of highly questionable authenticity, such as Andonian's memoirs of Naim Bey or copies of alleged documents used by the Turkish military tribunals after the end of the war. Armenians have also invoked the exterminatory consequences of the deportations, but this argument, as suggested in Chapter 5, rests on a logical fallacy and ignores the huge loss of life among Turkish civilians, soldiers, and prisoners of war due to sheer incompetence, neglect, starvation, and disease. All of these groups also experienced a huge death toll that surely cannot be explained in terms of a young Turk plan of annihilation. As noted earlier, some foreign diplomats also charged that the real aim of the Ottoman regime was to bring about the extermination of the Armenian people. Given the very large number of deaths and the observed complicity of many local officials in the murders, it is not surprising that not a few diplomats, like other eyewitnesses on the scene, concluded that the high death toll was an intended outcome of the deportations. Still, well-informed as many consular officials were about the horrible events unfolding before their eyes, their insight into the mindset and the real intentions of the young Turk leadership was necessarily limited to hunches and speculation. Their assertions of the existence of a scheme of annihilation were indeed merely assertions. The argument that the deportations in reality constituted a premeditated program of extermination of the Armenians of Turkey is difficult to square with many aspects and characteristics of the relocations. I mention here just a few of the most important. 1. The large Armenian communities of Constantinople, Smyrna, and Aleppo were spared deportation and, apart from tribulations such as hunger and epidemics that also afflicted the Muslim population of these cities, survived the war largely intact. The argument that the Turks refrained from deporting the Armenians in these cities in order to avoid unfavorable publicity is invalid, for the world heard of the deportations and accompanying massacres in the provinces almost as soon as they took place. Adverse publicity was not avoided by sparing the Armenians of these three important cities. These exemptions are analogous to Adolf Hitler failing to include the Jews of Berlin, Cologne, and Munich in the final solution. 2. The trek on foot that took so many lives was imposed only on the Armenians in eastern and central Anatolia, a part of the country that had no railroads. Although the once-Baghdad railway was overburdened with the transport of troops and supplies, the deportees from the western provinces and Cilicia who had the money were allowed to purchase tickets for travel by rail and thus were spared at least some of the tribulations of the deportation process. If, as is often alleged, the intent was to subject the exiles to a forced march until they died of exhaustion, why was this punishment not imposed on all of the deportees? 3. Many authors have pointed to the alleged basic uniformity of procedure characterizing the deportations and massacres as proof of the responsibility of the central government in Constantinople for these events. In fact, as we have seen, the deportations and resettlement exhibited a great deal of variation that depended on factors such as geography and the attitude of local officials. In the absence of a large Kurdish population, no massacres took place in Cilicia, and a substantial part of the Armenian exiles sent to southern Syria and Palestine survived. Some convoys from eastern Anatolia were robbed and massacred, while others arrived at their destination almost intact. Some of the exiles were given food here and there, while others were left to fend for themselves and often died of starvation. Some gendarmes accompanying the convoys protected their charges, while others sold them to Kurds, who pillaged and murdered them. In some places Protestant and Catholic Armenians as well as artisans were exempted from deportation, while in others all Armenians irrespective of creed and local necessity were sent away. Many of the deportees succumbed to the harsh conditions in the places of resettlement or were massacred there. Others were able to survive by making themselves useful as skilled workers or traders. In some locations large numbers of Armenians were allowed, or even forced, to convert, while in others conversion did not purchase exemption from deportation or assure survival. All these differences in treatment and outcomes are difficult to reconcile with a premeditated program of total annihilation. To question the existence of a deliberate scheme of destruction is not to deny the horrendous suffering of the Armenian exiles or the frequent occurrence of massacres. The Turkish side, which seeks to dismiss the mass killings as excesses or intercommunal warfare and often speaks of so-called massacres, therefore is distorting the historical record. In order to exculpate the Ottoman government from blame for the large number of deaths that accompanied the deportations, it is not enough to point to that government's many decrees and orders that commanded protection and compassionate treatment of the deportees. But if these events represented neither a plan of extermination nor simply the effects of natural causes and the unfortunate occurrence of excesses, what does account for the large loss of life during the deportations? An alternative explanation. I start with the assumption that the various decrees issued by the government in Constantinople dealing with the deportation and its implementation are genuine and were issued in good faith. The Ottoman government, I am inclined to believe, wanted to arrange an orderly process but did not have the means to do so. The momentous task of relocating several 100,000 people in a short span of time and over a highly primitive system of transportation was simply beyond the ability of the Ottoman bureaucracy. Neither existing institutions nor the officials were up to the task. Moreover, the deportation and resettlement of the Armenians took place as the country experienced severe food shortages and under totally inadequate conditions of sanitation that soon led to large-scale epidemics. I have described the disastrous results of this situation for the civilian population and the military in Chapter 5, when I discussed the issue of so-called genocidal consequences. Under conditions of Ottoman misrule, it was possible for the country to suffer an incredibly high death toll without a premeditated plan of annihilation. If we add that the deportations took place at a time of great insecurity in the countryside and that large numbers of deportees had to pass areas inhabited by hostile Kurds or settle amid equally rapacious Circassians, against whom the authorities failed to provide adequate protection, we have sketched out the crucial context for the human disaster that ensued. Many contemporary observers on the scene saw the tragedy in this light. The incompetence and the inefficiency of the Ottoman bureaucracy are a constant theme in the reports that have been preserved, though the logistical problem of moving and feeding so many people probably would have been highly challenging even for a more capable government apparatus. The lack of proper transportation facilities, Consul Nathan in Messina wrote to Ambassador Morgenthau on September 27, 1915, is the most important factor in causing the misery. The inadequate number of carts and carriages forces many deportees to travel on foot. Furthermore, the government failed to solve the problem of feeding the exiles. Thus at Osmani, where for the past few weeks there have always been from 40 to 60,000 people, the food supply is scarcely enough for 1/3 of that number, so that all are either on short rations or without food. This is responsible for the illness which prevails and the numerous deaths which are reported. Consul Rossler in Aleppo shared this view. In June 1914, before the outbreak of war, Rossler told his government that the authorities were incapable of handling the resettlement of Muslim refugees from Tripoli and the Balkans. These refugees had to live in mosques and created a threat to public order. The care for the Armenian deportees now constituted another bureaucratic fiasco. Despite the order of the Porte to feed the exiles, he informed his ambassador on September 14, the majority of them would gradually starve to death, since the Turks are incapable of solving the organizational task of mass feeding. Even if the officials had been full of goodwill, the challenge of providing food for the masses of destitute exiles was simply beyond their capability. Or as the American missionary Kate Ainsley put it, a government that is not able to feed even its soldiers, how is it to obey the beautiful paper instructions and see that the people are well fed and lack of nothing? According to the American journalist George Schreiner, who observed the misery of thousands of women, children, and decrepit men en route in the Taurus Mountains, Turkish ineptness, more than intentional brutality, was responsible for the hardships the Armenians were subjected to. The importance of the chaos that accompanied the expulsions was also stressed by the governor of Diyarbakir, Rashid Bey. In a memoir composed shortly before his suicide in 1919, Rashid Bey argued that the disorganization of the state authorities was so pronounced that an orderly deportation became impossible. A lengthy memorandum on the Armenian question drawn up by the German embassy official von Husch, probably in 1916, argued the same position. The authorities, he wrote, had been unprepared for the deportations and therefore had failed to provide food and protection for the exiles. However, given the large number to be relocated and the lack of competence on the part of officials available for this task, the outcome would not have been any different even if more time had been available. The central government, the German official maintained, was unable to enforce a uniform policy, and the way the deportations were handled therefore depended on the attitude of military or civilian authorities in the provinces. Some officials, such as Cemal Pasha, sought to alleviate the hardships of the exiles, but others were extremely hostile to the Armenians and abandoned the deportees to the violence of Kurds or Circassians. The government in Constantinople did not approve of these developments but did not do enough to prevent them either. The harsh climate, the long distances to be traversed on foot, and the arbitrariness of local officials all contributed to the human catastrophe that ensued. Writing more recently, Edward Eriksson has similarly concluded that the relocation of the Armenian population was fated to end in disaster. He has too benevolent a view of the Turkish officer corps, but the rest of his observations on the challenges presented by the deportations are on target. Administratively, such a scheme wildly exceeded Turkish capabilities. Even had the Turks been inclined to treat the Armenians kindly, they simply did not have the transportation and logistical means necessary with which to conduct population transfers on such a grand scale. Military transportation, which received top priority, illustrates this point, when first-class infantry units typically would lose a quarter of their strength to disease, inadequate rations, and poor hygiene while traveling through the empire. This routinely happened to regiments and divisions that were well equipped and composed of healthy young men, commanded by officers concerned with their well-being. Once again, in a pattern which would be repeated through 1918, Enver Pasha's plans hinged on non-existent capabilities that guaranteed inevitable failure. Consul Rosseler took the position that the Ottoman government would have to shoulder the responsibility for the disaster that had resulted from the lack of foresight, the malfeasance of the implementing authorities, and the general anarchy in the eastern provinces. The government was to be blamed, for it had sent the exiles into this chaotic situation. Morgenthau similarly rejected the Turkish excuse that not enough troops had been available to protect the deportees. If that is true, they had no right to deport them, because they knew they would be pillaged and murdered on the way unless properly protected. The argument that the Ottoman regime should have refrained from deporting the Armenians unless it could guarantee the smooth working of the relocation exaggerates the farsightedness of the Young Turk leadership. It assumes that these men were aware of the human catastrophe that would ensue, and this assumption is probably mistaken. If Enver could delude himself in 1914 that he would be able to wage a successful campaign against Russia in the Caucasus Mountains in the dead of winter without adequate provisions and clothing for his soldiers, a military disaster that resulted in the death of more than 70,000 men out of an original army of 90,000. He undoubtedly could have had equally strong illusions and misconceptions about the ability of his bureaucracy to accomplish the deportation of the Armenian community without too many problems. The prevailing indifference to human misery and the acceptance of the dispensability of human lives probably also played a role. A government as callous about the suffering of its own population as was the Ottoman regime could hardly be expected to be very concerned about the possible calamity that would result from deporting its Armenian population, rightly or wrongly suspected of treason. The conclusions of Guenter, a researcher with extensive immersion in the Ottoman archives, in my view are more on the mark. Given the state of the evidence from Ottoman sources, Dyer maintains, it is impossible to prove conclusively that the Young Turk regime did not initiate a program of deliberate genocide in the spring of 1915, but it seems to me most improbable that this was the case. Such a program requires a degree of calculation and foresight which was almost entirely absent in all the other actions of the Committee of Union and Progress government in the war. Dyer does not regard Talat, Enver, and their associates as cruel and savage dictators who ruthlessly exploited a long-sought opportunity for a much-desired genocide. He sees them not so much as evil men but as desperate, frightened, unsophisticated men struggling to keep their nation afloat in a crisis far graver than they had anticipated when they first entered the war. The Armenian decisions were taken at the height of the crisis of the Dardanelles, reacting to events rather than creating them, and not fully realizing the extent of the horrors they had set in motion in Turkish Armenia until they were too deeply committed to withdraw. I believe that the evidence I have examined and presented in this book is in line with Dyer's appraisal made more than 30 years ago. We do not know how many Armenians perished as a result of starvation and disease and how many were killed by Kurds, seeking booty and women, or by fanatic Muslims, who regarded the Armenians as infidels and traitors. For all of these occurrences the incompetent Ottoman regime bears some indirect responsibility. But there is a difference between ineptness, even ineptness that has tragic and far-reaching consequences, and the premeditated murder of a people. As we have seen, the government also badly mishandled its wounded soldiers, refugees, and prisoners of war, but one would hesitate to consider these acts of neglect and callousness a crime of equal magnitude as deliberate killing. Even the fact that some fanatic Young Turk officials welcomed the death of large numbers of Armenians is not the same as intentionally seeking and causing such deaths. It is impossible to ignore the horrors to which the Armenians were subjected, but it is important to see these terrible events in their proper historical context. The order for the deportation of the Armenian community was issued at a time of great insecurity, not to say panic, which made any calm calculation of possible consequences difficult and unlikely. Any full discussion of the events of 1915–16 also cannot ignore the impact of the loss of Van and the displacement of large numbers of Muslims in eastern Anatolia, who were forced to flee for their lives in the face of the advancing Russian armies and their Armenian helpers. This dislocation sharply increased hostility toward the Armenians among the Muslim population of the empire and added to the tensions created by charges of Armenian treason. The fear that the Armenian population constituted a fifth column may have been exaggerated, but it did have some basis in fact. While the Armenians were victims, not all of them were innocent victims, and the disaster that overtook them therefore was not entirely unprovoked. Most importantly, while the Ottoman government bears responsibility for the deportations that got badly out of hand, the blame for the massacres that took place must be put primarily on those who did the actual killing.